Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon from the UK. Good morning from Canada. I think we have to say a good morning to New Zealand, maybe a good evening to some people in the east of Europe. And thank you for everybody for joining so promptly. I think we've got almost everybody who said they were going to join has joined now. There may be one or two more people to join over the next few minutes. So I suggest we make a start anyway. So today is our first Asparagus webinar. It's co-hosted by myself, representing Global Plant Genetics, Ken Wall from Fox Seeds, and an asparagus grower and packer himself, and Dave Wallin, Professor David Wallin, who is the asparagus breeder at the University of Guelph. So the relationship between the three companies is that the University of Guelph, and where David Wallin's breeding program is, produces the new varieties. There's a strong focus on high quality green asparagus varieties. David has been the breeder there for around about 30 years now, which is unbelievable. It's how quickly time goes. And when the new varieties and selections come out of the Guelph program, they move over to a company called Fox Seeds, also based in Ontario, Canada, who are responsible for the seed production and then the seed commercialization on a global basis. Global Plant Genetics has an exclusive sublicense from Fox Seeds to commercialize the Guelph hybrids in Europe, and hence today's webinar, where we've come together as the three of us to talk in a bit more detail, both about the new varieties that have come from the program in the past 3 or 4 years, as well as have a preview into the future, and then get a perspective from a grower's angle and a packer's angle on the varieties. And we'll follow that up with a question and answer session. So just to say, we are recording the webinar, so it will be available to those people who have attended, who maybe want to have a look at some of the aspects in more detail later. But again, for some people who were not able to make it today, but were interested in the webinar itself. We'll have a question and answer session at the end. So if anybody has any questions, please post them in the chat box, which should be available at the bottom of all of your screens. We have actually had 1 or 2 questions sent to us by email in advance, so we're geared up in that respect. So I think without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Wallin, who will talk in more detail about the breeding program, the new varieties, and where the future is for the program. Over to you, David.
Okay, thank you. Can you see the screen?
Looks good to me.
Okay, very good. Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you today. I'd like to thank Jamie for inviting me. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about our program and some of our hybrids and upcoming hybrids for the future. First, I'd like to just talk a little bit about Guelph Millennium, which has been our standard cultivar and our basis on which we want to make improvements. I'll give a little bit overview of the breeding and the commercialization pathway. We'll talk about our 2 new releases, Equinox and Eclipse, and I'll just start introducing some of our other hybrids that are in the pipeline. So Millennium has been our standard for quite a number of years, and it does have good yields. It also has longevity. We have growers here in Ontario who have fields that are 18 years old and are still harvesting them profitably. This picture on the left here shows a field. It's about an 8-year-old field with Guelph Millennium and one of the US cultivars that were previously grown here. And this just shows that Millennium does hold up compared to some of our other cultivars that start declining after a number of years. Millennium has shown good quality. Millennium also is used extensively in Michigan, where they're in a replant situation. And Millennium is adapted to our cold winters. We're probably one of the coldest areas in the world breeding asparagus with our cold winter temperatures. Now, Millennium isn't perfect. We do know if you don't have a spray program that the foliar diseases can come in. We also know that in the harvest season, if you do have periods of extreme heat, that you do lose some of the tip quality as well. So as part of our breeding strategy, we're always trying to improve traits, and the two most important ones are yield and quality that we want to improve relative to Millennium. We also want to maintain the good longevity that we've seen, and we're also trying to make incremental improvements in the disease aspect. But you know, a cultivar that is perfect for disease but doesn't have the yield and quality is not going to make it. And our growers always say to me, if you get that superb variety with the yield and quality, we'll simply spray for the disease. So disease is on our radar, but it's not the number one aspect of the improvements. So in our breeding process, we select in the nursery, so we can have a breeding nursery with new genetic material, and we make our crosses. And the first step of the breeding process is we cross our females and super males to produce our all-male hybrids. And these go out in what I call preliminary trials at one location at our research farm in Simcoe, Ontario. And our data is 3 full harvests. So essentially this is a 6-year trial. The first 2 years we do not harvest. The 3rd year it's a short harvest. In years 4, 5, and 6, it's full harvests. And then from there we make a decision. If something is looking good or shows promise, it has a UG code. So if you ever see something that starts with UG, it tells you that the minimum, at the minimum, it did well in a preliminary trial. From there, we try to get more data and more years of harvest, and we have various collaborators. Well, we at the university run the trials again. We have farmers in Ontario and other collaborators in North America and elsewhere in the world. If something does well, it goes to Fox Seed, and they develop seed cages for pre-commercialization. They will start some grower strip trials, and eventually a decision is made to commercialize something, and it's given a name, Guelph something. So today I want to look at some data from our different trials, and I have many trials, or data from many trials. And one of the complications is that not all cultivars are in every trial. And I'm going to try to summarize over different trials that may have different numbers of harvests. So to try to simplify all this data in easy to understand format, I'm going to express everything relative to Guelph Millennium, as that's a control across all the trials to kind of standardize them. So for example, if we were to get actual data of 8,000 kilograms per hectare of Guelph Equinox and 6,000 for Millennium, what I'll be presenting to you today is relative to Millennium. So we set Millennium to 100%. In this case, Equinox is 133% of Millennium, or essentially a 33% increase in yield. I'll also be presenting data on the percent marketable. So this is the weight of the #1 grade spears relative to the total weight that is harvested. So the #1 grade spears have a nice tight tip, and they have a minimum diameter standard. So if something graded out at 80% and Millennium was 70%, I'm also going to convert that and standardize that to Millennium being 100% and the other variety being a percentage of that. So Guelph is a cultivar I'm sure many are familiar with. And if we look at the cumulative yield relative to Guelph Millennium, so we're looking at Millennium set at 100%, and we have trials in Ontario, Washington, and Michigan. You can see that Guelph more or less is similar to Guelph Millennium. We do see trial to trial variability, but in general, there's similar performance. So Guelph Equinox is one of our newer cultivars. And when we look at the data across different trials in different locations, again, Millennium is set at 100%. In Ontario, we do see some nice yield increases across most of our trials. and that holds up as well in trials that we see in Washington. And for some reason in Michigan, Guelph Equinox is not much different than Guelph Millennium, generally similar yields. Now, Guelph Eclipse is another cultivar that has come forward. And right away you see that it does show some variability in performance. We do have many trials that have shown us superior yield, but there does seem to be some variability in trials, which suggests there might be some other sensitivities in this cultivar, and you do want to trial it in your own particular area and be sure it does well. Generally, it's not worse than Millennium, but we do see potential of it being better. This cultivar does have other attributes, especially if you're looking for spears with larger diameter, that it might fit into your production system. And Ken Wall will talk a little bit more about how Guelph Eclipse fits into his packing system. So the percent marketable, so this is the grade out. This is a measure of quality. So again, this is the total weight of number 1 spears relative to the total weight that is harvested. When we look at Millennium and Guelph, similar grade out. When we look at Guelph Equinox, we can see that across many different trials, it is showing better quality than Millennium and better grade out. Eclipse, we saw variability in trials, but we do see a number of trials where Eclipse also produces better quality spears than Guelph Millennium. So as I mentioned, spear diameter is something we look at. So we look at the average spear weight, but since all the spears are generally cut to the same length, the average spear weight is essentially a proxy for diameter. The more spears weigh when they're equal length, the larger the diameter will be. So again, if we standardize to Guelph Millennium, Guelph similar or sometimes a little larger spear. Guelph Equinox does have a rather consistent spear size, similar to Guelph Millennium. And in most cases, we see that Guelph Eclipse does have a larger spear, larger weight, meaning larger diameter. Now, disease, we do see trial variability and possibly some incremental gains in disease. So when we consider disease, the lower number is the better because it's less disease. And looking at Eclipse in blue, Equinox in orange, and Millennium in red, here we are looking at one particular trial over 2 years, maybe small incremental gains, for example, in rust, nothing significant enough that you would want to alter a spray program. And likewise, if you look at foliar stemphillium disease, maybe some small incremental gains, but again, you wouldn't alter a spray program. We have another trial, completely different, at our research farm. And in this one, for some reason, Eclipse was slightly more than Millennium for rust, and also a little bit more than Millennium for stemphillium. So we're seeing some variability with Eclipse. In general, the take-home message here is, generally, maybe some small incremental gains in disease, but not enough to change a spray program. And when we look at our cultivars compared to some of the other cultivars from breeding programs from around the world, we have a trial with all the major cultivars for green. All the cultivars do show disease susceptibility when you stop spraying, as we do at the end of the season. Our cultivars are not significantly better or worse than the other cultivars that are on the market. So we have our Guelph hybrids. Our standard has been Millennium. We have Eclipse. Eclipse, as you can see here, it's tending to have larger diameter spears. And if you have a market for that, this might be an interesting cultivar to try. And then we have Equinox, improved relative to Millennium for yield and its quality and grade out. So we're always evaluating new hybrid combinations. And I'll just highlight a couple that are in the pipeline and you might see years down the road. But I do want to emphasize, do not delay your current plantings waiting for these. These are still in the testing phase and commercial seed could be years away. But one of the nice things about this new hybrid UG28, we do see a lot of consistent and good improvements, again, relative to Millennium across multiple trials. And then we have improved quality relative to Millennium as well. The other hybrid to keep an eye on is UG23. Now this has similar yield to Guelph Millennium, so it's not going to be a big boost in yield, but the quality is very good. So if you look at these spears, they're harvested from the same trial on the same day. And as you can see here in Guelph Millennium, you can see those side shoots starting to break out through the scale leaves in Millennium. And when you look at UG23, nowhere near any sign of losing that tip quality. It also, you see, is a little lighter in terms of its pigmentation. So just to summarize, Eclipse and Equinox are some of our newer varieties, and we're seeing improvements for various traits like yield and quality. There is trial variability for Eclipse, so one needs to trial it carefully. Eclipse can give you a larger diameter spear if that's what you're interested in. And we are continuously breeding. I showed you some hybrids in the pipeline, and there's others coming along as well, for the long-term future of our breeding program. I'll stop there. Turn it over to Jamie. Jamie, I'm not sure if we do questions now or I think you said at the end.
Yeah,
Okay.
Dave, thank you very much. That was great. The plan is to have the questions at the end. If Paula and Ken can sort out their presentation, in the meantime, Ken, if you can bring that up, and I will just ask you one question, Dave, during the handover. One question that we get a little bit is with regard to seasonality of varieties, and breeders are generally close to 100% focused on breeding for earlier and earlier varieties, which is almost a little bit at the expense of later season material. Are you doing any work on later season breeding, or what are your thoughts on that?
So by later season, I assume you're meeting the harvest profile and not emerging earlier, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So
yeah, right.
That can be an issue with varieties that emerge and throw a lot of their production in the first couple of weeks and then tail off. If we can find a more level harvest profile, that'd be great.
Yeah, so we are investigating it, and one of the challenges is how do you actually characterize harvest profile? Because one of the issues we face is that from year to year, our seasons are so different, right? In our climate here, we usually start harvesting around the 1st of May, but some years you're delayed until the 15th or 18th of May. Or some years you get a 30 degree the first week of May and then you get a flush, or it's cool and then it's up and you get a flush. And so the biggest challenge we've had in trying to characterize the varieties is, well, how do you actually figure out what the true profile is? Because when you graph things from year to year, it's very difficult to do. So we, this year, came up, or there was a published mathematical model for dealing with this. And I think we've now have a mathematical model where you can come up with a single number, which tells you whether you're going to have a skew early in the season, a skew late in the season, or uniform harvest across the season. So right now we're in the process of taking all our hybrids, over all our different trials and all our different years and trying to characterize them and start looking for material that has different harvest profiles. And then that'll trace us back to the parents that might give different harvest profiles. And then that'll give us opportunities to produce hybrids in any particular direction. So it's something, on our radar, but it's not the easiest thing to characterize with the variability we see here in our climate from year to year, because we're not a consistent, uniform warm-up every year. But it is on our radar, and I know our growers here would like something that has greater yield or harvest profile where you get greater yields towards the end of the season rather than flushing early.
Great, thank you. So Ken, if we can hand over to you, are you planning to share any slides, or are you just talking?
No, I don't have any slides, but I'd like to share some perspectives from our experience with Equinox and some of these other varieties from both a grower and a packer, and as well as a marketer perspective, which is what we are involved in. And by the way, first of all, let me just say it is so good to see any number of these faces. I recognize quite a few of you from our experiences together at various symposiums and the Asparagus days in either Italy or in France. It is really unfortunate. I was so looking forward to the Asparagus days this last year, and also the symposium, which I understand has been canceled for this year. But hopefully we get through everything and make some changes over the next number of years, and we can get back to meeting face to face, which I really enjoy. Again, I want to provide some perspectives on several of these varieties from a grower, from a packer, and then also a marketer perspective, which we're engaged in all areas here in Canada and throughout the US market as well. We have Millennium, as Dave mentioned, Millennium has been the industry standard, and everything is measured here in North America based on how it does compared to Guelph Millennium. And it truly has been a bit of a savior for our industry. Dave showed one picture of the Jersey varieties, and they all fell apart on us in a huge way over the last 15 or 20 years. So we're very, very thankful for the Guelph breeding program and the work that Dr. William has done over the last number of years. So Millennium has been our standard. About 4 or 5 years ago, we had Guelph Equinox had looked okay in some of the trials, but suddenly it started jumping out, specifically out of Washington State. And we were very, very intrigued by some of the results that we're seeing in Washington. And so we pursued, we had some seed available, and we put a series of trials in here in Ontario. That was in 2015 and 2016. That Equinox became available to harvest in 2018. We ran into massive labor issues in the spring of 2018, weren't able to harvest anything on those new trials. And so our first harvest, commercial harvest on Equinox, happened in 2019, and then again this year in 2020. So actual field trials, we have approximately 3 separate blocks of Equinox mixed in together with a number of different varieties. Altogether, I would say, I think we have about 7 acres, so 3 hectares or so of Equinox in commercial settings. And we harvested that over the last several years. This is what we're seeing from a yield perspective, approximately 10 to 20%. The yield improvement over Millennium. These are not replicated trials. I don't have accurate, really accurate data because they're not replicated. But what we're seeing in side-by-side trials compared to Guelph Millennium is approximately 10 to 20% yield increase. Partially, that is a function of a slightly larger diameter. And Dave's trial results is showing that there is a 5, 6, 7% yield, size improvement compared to Millennium, and that's what we're seeing as well. And partially, that's a function of slightly improved spear numbers. Earliness is not an issue here in the North American market. In fact, in many cases, as growers here certainly in Canada, we don't want anything earlier because we're subjected to a lot of spring frosts. So we don't really have any issues. I know many of you in Europe and in New Zealand and Australia that I speak to are very, very concerned about getting access to that earlier market. We don't see any difference in earliness with any of our varieties. In fact, I've trialed some German varieties, some Lim material over the years, and some Southwest material out of Germany. Everything just comes on all at once. There is no difference in earliness. So I can't speak to that issue whatsoever. Dave also mentioned some slight improvements in resistance to foliar diseases. We have not seen that specifically in our own fields with any of these varieties because we're spraying it all, and we maintain a regular spray program over all of it. So keeping the fern clean and green throughout the summer and into the fall has not been an issue with a regular spray maintenance program. So we don't really see any difference there, again, from a commercial grower perspective. We bring that product into our pack house and we run automated graders out of Germany. And what's really important for us on those lines is the uniformity piece. And this, in my mind, the uniformity and the tip quality is really where Equinox has jumped to the front of the line from our perspective. The spear diameter, not quite as big as Eclipse, but we're seeing amazing uniformity. All of the spears are within that standard to large designation. Actually, that 7/16 up to 5/8 inch, like everything is within those parameters, and we're really excited about that. That makes our grading lines run so much better, and our packouts are so much improved as a result of that. The best part, in my mind, on the Guelph Equinox has been the quality of the tips, and we're just blown away with the type of tip quality that we can get. We get a lot of very, very warm temperatures in the month of June. In fact, we see it's not unusual for us to get quite a few days of 30 degrees plus Celsius throughout our harvest season. That's where, as Dave points out as well, Millennium has struggled a little bit with, especially in dry conditions, and we're on some very, very sandy soils. And so we have struggled with tip quality. What we're seeing on the Equinox, and this is really exciting, we're seeing spears that are in some cases 18, 19, and 20 inches, where it's got really hot and the product has just simply gotten away on us, and it still retains tip quality, tight tip closure in hot conditions in the month of June. So we're ecstatic because with that tip quality, because it gives us a lot of flexibility on harvest and harvest management without losing our quality along the way. So from a recovery and yield perspective in the pack house, we've been very, very pleased with Equinox, and it certainly has been a step ahead, a significant improvement over our industry standard Guelph Millennium. Finally, I want to talk about the appearance of this product. And again, it harkens back to that tip quality. As a marketer, when we ship product across the North American continent, one of the things that always comes back to us, you know, we often get pictures and saying, hey, obviously it's the end of your season, starting to fall apart. And yes, when it gets hot and it's dry, we do struggle with our tip quality. And what we're seeing with Equinox is a maintenance of tip quality. And we think we're going to be able to extend our season ever so slightly as a result of that, simply because the tips are really, really holding themselves very, very tightly. We just love the appearance. There's something else, and one of Dave's slides actually showed this. And the pictures that I had that I wanted to show today simply were not good enough. I guess it's as a result of, I'm just using my iPhone to take some of these pictures, but the green on the Equinox spear is ever so slightly more vibrant than either Eclipse or Millennium. And I really like that from a marketing perspective. It really jumps out and off the shelf. So we're quite pleased with that. We haven't spent enough time and done enough trials and actual comparisons side by side pull that out and to prove something along those lines, and for me to guarantee that that's what you're going to see with Equinox. But in our walking through the fields and looking at the lugs as they come off the field, we're really impressed with the look on Equinox. We think it jumps off the shelf quite nicely. So here's what I can tell you, and as a grower, and I know quite a few of you are growers, you're certainly dealing with growers. I will not encourage anyone to plant something. I know how expensive it is to put an acre or a hectare of asparagus in the ground. I will not encourage someone to put something in just because I'm hoping that you purchase some of this seed. As a grower here in the Canadian market, here in North America, playing around in the North American market, as we move our program ahead on our own farm, our primary focus over the next number of years, as we get access to seed, and obviously seed access has been a bit of a problem with Equinox, but Equinox will be the primary variety that we will focus on our own farms here in Ontario. We will also look to Eclipse. We believe that's also a great variety from a tip quality and diameter perspective. We struggle a little bit in the North American market with selling a larger or a jumbo spear. And there is limited market for jumbos, although in the last year or two, we're seeing increased movement and interest on the part of retailers for larger diameter spears. So we will have a portion of our fields dedicated to Eclipse to give us some of that increased diameter. But our primary focus is going to be on Equinox because of all the reasons I mentioned. Some improved yield over Millennium, slightly larger diameter compared to Millennium, that uniformity and the tip quality. So the Equinox, certainly a real winner from our perspective, and we're very excited about pursuing that variety in our own fields and farms here in Ontario.
Great, thank you, Ken. Fantastic. So thanks to both Dave and to Ken for two fantastic presentations, and we've been able to see in great detail there both the scientific and the practical applications of the breeding program and how these varieties can be used. We've certainly noticed a very substantial increase in interest in Guelph Equinox, particularly in the last two seasons. This year even more than last year, and it looks like that's going to increase for future years as it's now performing so well. The trials that we've got in place in Europe across 4 countries are all looking superb. It's looking very early. It's very interesting how the market for asparagus varieties has moved on significantly in the last 3 to 5 years, particularly in the early sector. We're seeing in Europe new varieties, 3 or 4, maybe 5 varieties replacing what has been the industry standard over here very quickly, and we're pleased to say that Guelph Equinox can very much play a part in that, and the Eclipse too, based on its spear diameter. So in addition to that, there are other territories where we're seeing further increased interest in green asparagus that may have been formerly completely white asparagus producers. So that also brings about more opportunities for higher quality green varieties. In conversations, recent conversations and meetings with the team at Fox Seeds, we're pleased to say that there are new seed blocks going in of Equinox that will help to address this need and requirement for the seed over the next coming years. And the future's looking rosy. So it's exciting. We've had some questions come in, so maybe these can go to both Ken and Dave if both of you can make sure you're unmuted. One question that's come in was, what are the recommended planting densities and depths for Equinox and Eclipse in your growing conditions?
I can respond to that one, Jamie. What we're seeing, again, this is in our growing conditions here in Ontario, but standard planting depth over the last number of years has been approximately 8 inches in depth. You'll have to translate that into
20 centimeters.
Okay.
Yeah.
So again, approximately 8 inches in depth. Now we're looking at two different things as it relates to planting density. In most cases here in Ontario, we're planting on 4 foot, which is approximately what, 1.1 meter?
1.2.
1.2 meters. And I know that's relatively tight compared to many of you in Europe, and I've traveled throughout sections of Europe and senior fields. You are obviously farther apart than where we are. But we're shooting for, on Equinox, we're still shooting for approximately 15 to 16,000 plants per acre. And again, Jamie, you'll have to translate that into hectares.
37.5 to 40,000 per hectare.
Okay. And that's been industry standard for Millennium for quite some years throughout North America. When it comes to Guelph Eclipse, because of its propensity to send up much larger diameter spears, and again, I mentioned that there is improved demand for larger diameter spears in the North American market, but we're still not where many of you, and certainly in Europe, are, where that larger diameter spear is so readily accepted. And so what many of us have done with Guelph Eclipse is we just simply bumped our plant density up just to tighten it up and to slightly reduce the overall average diameter. So we're closer to 18 to 20,000 plants per acre on Eclipse. Jamie, you're
45 to 50,000 per hectare.
Okay.
Yeah, those densities, I think, are a lot of that would be borne out by the fact that you're on 1.2 meter row spacings. I think we might struggle to grow on similar densities over here when we're more like 1.8 or 2 meters apart. So growers who are planting, let's say, 5 crowns per meter are more or less at 30,000 per hectare. And the trials that we've seen that are planted in Europe are more or less at 30,000 per hectare. And we're seeing good results. I mean, back in the day when we were doing the plant density trials on Guelph Millennium, we were testing it at 4, 6, 8 and 10 crowns per meter. And we found a yield increase at 6 that tailed off after when we got any bigger than that. So when we're 1.8 or 2 meters apart, I think 30, 35,000 maybe at the max is probably where we would get to. Although that scientifically proven test hasn't been done yet in terms of the optimum plant density, but something to look out for. Thank you.
I should comment that at our research station, we do have a density depth experiment. So it's replicated and it's planted in 2 separate locations on our research farm. And we are including Millennium, Eclipse, and Equinox. So we are looking into how density might affect the spear diameter of especially Eclipse. So this coming season will be the first year of full harvest on that trial. So in the years ahead, we might have some more definitive data on density and depth and how it affects especially the Eclipse and its spear size or spear diameter. Great.
Well, that's great. We'll keep an eye on that. Thank you. Ken, you mentioned spear length, and so did you, Dave, and the improved tip quality on Equinox. I remember on several trips to Canada when I've been into your pack house, Ken, that your spear length that you're marketing seems to be longer than many of the European markets. What is your standard spear length that you're marketing at when it leaves your pack house?
10 inches is our maximum spear length in the marketplace.
Okay. Yeah, 25 centimeters. Okay. Yeah, we would be more like 20, 23, something like that. So 10% or so less. Okay. Another question that came in that I think you half covered it, or maybe a little bit more, Ken, was how do you measure varietal performance in the pack house?
Again, I guess in some ways, certainly the larger, one of the issues that we look at in the pack house is, our recoveries so we bring 1,000 pounds of raw material in, what kind of recovery are we going to get? But in also a lot of ways, we're very, very concerned about throughput. So, that's where Eclipse is a real winner because it comes in and these very, very large diameter spears, you can move, and a number of you are utilizing some of the automated grading equipment as we are, and we're grading one spear at a time. So the larger the spear, the more the throughput. So as a packer, I love Guelph Eclipse because I can slam through massive volumes in a very, very quick period of time. Obviously, as a marketer, I also have to be concerned about where am I going to sell that product. So that's, again, it has to be this happy balance between throughput and the capacity to move the product at the end of the day. Again, that's where we're really, really thrilled with Equinox, which gives us, for our North American market, a very nice balanced approach. So we get the volume, we get the throughput, and at the same time, we get the recoveries coming off because the tip quality is so good. And so it's worked out extremely well for us. Did I answer that, Jamie, or did I dance around that bush?
I think so. I'm sure I'll receive a message if you didn't from the poser of the question. One more topic that's come up a couple of times here is on season extension and seasonality, which is something that's difficult, that we understand is difficult to quantify and to measure in Ontario, because you go from cold soils to warm soils and very quickly, and your harvest season starts when it starts and finishes end of June or so, and you don't really see the varietal variations that we do in some parts of Europe, particularly the more maritime parts of Europe. So in the UK, for example, we see big differences in seasonality between early and late varieties. And let's say this is a webinar about Guelph varieties, and so there's 10 or even 14 days sometimes difference between Equinox and Millennium, and whether that's emergence or getting up to sort of manageable marketable yields on a daily basis. You mentioned potential season extension from Equinox, Ken, which was not something I'd ever heard of before, because we would consider that an early variety, but I think you were coming at it from a different perspective.
Again, we don't see any difference in earliness, and I've run all the trials and walk the fields and try and see whether or not did one variety come up half a day earlier. There is no difference in any of the varieties. And again, we've had the German varieties and the Dutch varieties. We've had everything, and everything comes up all at once. And that's simply because we go from, minus freeze your backside off type temperatures in March and April to, we seldom have a spring here. We have winter, and then it's suddenly summer. So we don't see the difference in earliness, Jamie, like you talk about with some of those maritime temperatures, for example, in England. And that earliness debate is a non-existent one here in the North American market. On the season extension, we have plenty of summer and fall to give us enough carbohydrate production in the months of July, August, September, and certainly over the last 10 or 15 years. We even had a frost in our region. Lots of times it's not until the 1st of November. So we're still producing carbohydrates in October and having plenty of time to develop carbohydrate reserves in the plant. So the idea is it possible for us to extend our normal harvest from approximately the end of June into a week or so in July? And we've had a number of growers doing that over the last number of years, primarily with Millennium, because that's what we mostly have. And one of the reasons, and they've been quite successful with it and have had a lot of success. In fact, Dave, you talked about the 18-year-old field of Millennium. That field has been harvested from the 1st of May till about July the 10th for all of its 18 years. And they've had great success with that field and great yield and great quality. The reason that we have often, though, stopped harvesting at the end of June or the first week of July, well, there's a number of reasons. In some cases, we're so sick and tired of looking at asparagus, we want to move on to the next crop. But the other reason is that when it gets so hot, end of June and July, we get a lot of 30-degree temperatures. Our tip quality starts to fall apart on the Millennium. We are not seeing that with the Equinox, not seeing that with Eclipse. So if our tip quality hangs on into those warmer temperatures, late June, early July, I potentially am looking at another 10 to 12 days in harvest potential, because the market will continue to accept those tight tips. And the market is very, very keen on continuing to support the local deal as opposed to transitioning back into Peru, which is where most of North America goes in July, August, and September. So that's the kind of the idea, and what we want to pursue a little bit over the next number of years is extending our season. And I think we can do that much more successfully with Equinox than we ever could with Millennium.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. One more question has come in that's on a similar topic. It's on the harvest profile. Do you see, again, to both Ken and Dave, I think, do you see any differences in terms of the peak of harvest across the three cultivars, let's say when the temperatures get extremely hot in late May, early June, or whatever it is? Are there any variations in the harvest profiles of the three?
Go ahead, Dave.
This winter we're using the index, and we're analyzing all that data across multiple trials. So we'll have a definitive answer soon on that with the mathematical model that we're using. Maybe Ken can give his impressions just from his harvest records.
This is a bit of a tough one. Again, I don't have replicated trials, and my yield results are not scientific. It's more of a walking the fields and taking a look. For those of you who do have Millennium in the ground, you know that it is a massive peak of production early in the season. In the first 2-3 weeks, you kind of get overwhelmed, and then the curve kind of flattens out. What we think we're seeing is that that yield curve does not flatten out to the same extent, and we're wondering if maybe that's where some of our yield improvements have been. We're not seeing the decline in the yield in the latter half of our season as we do with Millennium. So we think our yield is staying up a little bit in the month of June, the latter half of our season with Equinox, which, and again, I don't have science, I don't have hard and fast numbers on that. That's more of a gut reaction as we're walking the fields and looking at these fields. Hopefully some of Dave's numbers will give us a little more scientific backing for that thinking.
Great, thank you. One more question that's come in. It's not specifically about varieties, but has anybody, or Ken, have you had any experience with planting plug plants, seedlings, transplants? They're called different things around the world, modules, in the autumn, in the fall, in September, for example?
I have played with planting crowns in the fall. In fact, we grow a lot of crowns here as well for the community. And I had a grower a number of years ago who knew he was not going to be able to get on his ground very early in the spring. And so he insisted that I dig his crowns in the fall and provide them to him. And this is about 10 or 15 years ago. And I thought he was crazy and refused to provide any guarantee on the crowns going in the ground. But he insisted, put them in the ground, and he's had amazing success with it. We have since done that on a number of occasions using crowns in fall plant, and we have no problems with it whatsoever. The only downside to us is because we are in such light sandy soils, we plant in the fall and then cover the crowns up, and then that sandy ground sits wide open for the winds to come in and pick up sand and move topsoil over the course of the winter. As it relates to plugs, or we call them plugs here, seedlings in speedlings. We have not done any fall planting, but what we have seen and had some good success with is actually planting them in midsummer. And so we'll go in the month of July, for example, and drop those plugs into the ground. Obviously, the importance of irrigation it's pretty crucial, and so we're using drip irrigation. In fact, we're using, in most cases, everything is being planted with subsoil drip irrigation, and we've had good success with that. The nice part with dropping in the plugs in the middle of the summer is that we do not have the weed pressure in our fields like we do with planting in, let's say, the end of May. So I don't have any experience with planting in August, September, or October with a plug, but we've had relatively good success in a number of fields in the community where we planted in the month of July.
Okay, well, the question has come from a very continental climate in Ukraine, and I would struggle to think that that would be a successful thing to do, an autumn planting of a plug. I've seen it in Spain in early September, and it's looked good, but I think in a cold climate, that's pretty late, and you're expecting that plant to do a lot and develop a lot of roots to get through the winter in advance. So I would advise caution, I think, on that. One more question has come in about specifically about breeding, and if Dave, if you're anticipating climate change and the potential reduction in chilling requirement or chilling hours that are going to be available when you're breeding new varieties. You got any comments on that, Dave?
Well, from a breeding perspective, all we can do is breed in our climate and select as we go along relative to the chilling. I mean, that's still, something that I think we still need to study further, and still including our chilling requirement, because I think there's issues in terms of breaking dormancy and chilling requirement, but also trigger temperatures after, the crown may reach a certain number of chilling days. So, we do have a graduate student looking at aspects of dormancy. We might start getting some answers there, but I think you have to break it down into those two components. Is there a chilling requirement? And then after chilling, is there a trigger of soil temperature that causes plants to move forward? So I don't think we have enough information, with our material and our climate to make a definitive statement on that. In terms of climate change, to me, the biggest issue is going to be if the climate becomes more erratic, especially in the spring with freeze-thaw cycles. I think that's where we might get some problems with frost damage after plants do begin to break dormancy.
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you. We've got, more questions are coming in. Okay, so there's one question probably directed towards me. What is the difference between in earliness of the Guelph hybrids in Europe? And we're seeing the Equinox and the Eclipse very, very similar in terms of emergence. If we're comparing them to Guelph, as we often used to in the past, let's suggest, then similar or slightly earlier in the case of Equinox, and then Millennium in Europe, generally in the more maritime parts of Europe, is circa 10 days later, 7 to 10 days, occasionally 14 days later than Guelph. The more maritime it is, the later it seems to be. The more continental it is, the earlier it seems to be, which rings true with with how the variety performs in Ontario. It comes out of the ground relatively early, and there's a big peak of production, which we don't really see in the maritime climates. It's behind by approximately 7 to 10 days, 14 occasionally. One more question, which is probably for Ken, and it's a question that gets asked, I think, on every grower group, Asparagus grower group, which is on the advice on the timing of fertilizer applications. What do you do, Ken? Do you put it all on after harvest, or half before and half after, or something different? Or Dave, have you got any opinions on that too, please?
Yeah, we bounced around on this one over the years, and it used to be everything post-harvest, and then I think many of you will be familiar with the Aspire USA or Aspire New Zealand program. Actually, I want to take that away from our New Zealand friends. That program was developed down there, and we started working with Neil Drost here in North America, and he did some really, really good, interesting work in terms of uptake and utilization of fertility. We've got to the point where we're doing a program on our nitrogen. We start early, and we spoon feed throughout the season up until throughout the harvest season, a heavier dose in July post-harvest, and then we finish with nitrogen by the end of July. So we don't extend or encourage too much bud break in August and September. With all of our other macros, phosphate, potash, potassium, and all of the micros, we maintain a spoon feeding program starting early on in the season and going right through into September. So it's making sure that there is nutrition available to the plant at all times. Now, our situation is a little bit different. Some of you have been on our farms, and you thought you were walking a beach somewhere, because that's what we are farming on. It's extremely coarse, sandy soil, and so certainly nitrogen. But as we've come to realize, even some of the other macros and the micros will move through our soil profile relatively quickly, and so it's really important to us to spoon feed so we avoid leaching of nutrient material outside the root zone.
Great, thank you, Ken. Any additional comments on that, Dave?
No, I think that serves the question well.
Thank you. Ken, another question for you. Are you still using rye as an overwinter cover crop? And do you have any composting applications within your process?
Yes, rye, we started using rye actually about 40 years ago. So we're in a complete no-till system. And the upside is our sand doesn't pick up and blow. We have an amazing carpet of dead rye. We burn it off in the spring, and that rye lays flat on top of our fields. And we have an amazing, maintains moisture, helps us to maintain moisture, keeps the sand from blowing, prevents sand splash up during a heavy rain event. Those are all the upsides. The downside is we do not get rid of our overwintering Staphylium spores. And so purple spot is the bane of my existence, and I struggle mightily with that. We've done everything that we possibly can. We've done, I think Andreas, you're on here, and we followed through on your ideas with flaming in the spring. Just about burned up the county several times by running through that process. We had zero success with eliminating overwintering spores using propane flamers. We've done absolutely everything. The only thing that really works is tillage in the spring. But of course, as soon as I do that, I expose a lot of sand, and the wind picks it up and blows it across and creates all kinds of other problems. Now, the other interesting thing that we've done over the last number of years, many of us who have been at the Christian Beth's Asparagus Days have listened to him talk about the 10-foot, Jamie, what is that, 3-meter asparagus planting program. Some of you on here might actually have been doing this and utilizing this program. We actually put a planting in. I ended up with some extra crowns this last spring and ended up putting in a 20-acre block, and we did it all on a 10-foot spacing, which will enable us to, and our plan is to produce a cover crop, grow between the beds in between those 10-foot rows, and then simply blow on the cover crop that I'm growing directly on top of the rows to create a bed of blown in, dried up cover crop material right on top of those rows of spears. I'd love to share more about that at some other time. This is obviously not the time, but we're playing around with some new approaches utilizing Christian Beth's 10-foot planting program.
Great, thank you. I think we've got one last question that's just come in, and I think I know the answer, but I can expand on it if you can't. Do you have any experience with mini tunnels on the two new varieties?
Yes, we do.
You do? Okay, all right. I'm wrong.
It was a complete disaster. And the reason is, again, it's our temperature situation. We go from nasty cold in March and April, and then end of April and 1st of May suddenly gets hot. So I put up some mini tunnels and set those in place. And immediately, within a day or so, there was nothing else emerging in the rest of the farms. But on that 50 foot of mini tunnel, and these were just the short, I don't know, they were 2 feet high or something, with some plastic and wire hoops. And within a day or two of putting these hoops up, we saw immediate emergence. So I got all excited. My gosh, I'm going to be the first one in the market. I'm going to take this thing by storm. And I think about 24 hours later, I went back out to look, and the spears were all easily 2 feet long, and they were pushing out the edges of the plastic, and they were all seeded out, and they looked absolutely horrendous. So it got so hot, it must have been, eventually I went over and put a thermometer inside, and I think we had something like 45 or 50 degrees Celsius inside the tunnels. The sun gets so blistering hot here early on in the spring, and all it takes is a couple of hours of that, and we've all seen what asparagus does in those kinds of temperatures. So a complete disaster. Doesn't work.
In Canada.
In Canada, sorry. Doesn't work in our situation. I know it works in many other places, and certainly many of you in Europe are having great success with it, and I wish you well. It doesn't work here.
Yeah, no, we're seeing good success with Equinox in mini tunnels and with large walk-in tunnels. So yeah, I think like good early varieties, they perform well in those systems. Perfect. Well,
exactly.
Great. So we've reached the hour, and I think everybody's been in enough Zoom meetings and webinars over the past 12 months to think that an hour is a good time. So I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to thank Paula for arranging today, interacting with the speakers and with everybody who's come to attend. Some great work there. To Dave and to Ken for some great presentations, and to the audience, or everybody who's taken the time out of their days to attend, participate, and we've had a great Q&A session. There will be a recording which we'll send to everybody if people have others in their business that would like to see it, and of course we all remain on call for any questions or any comments. So from me and Global Plant Genetics, thank you very much, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks so much.
Cheers. Bye-bye.